good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event entitled Tackling the Rise of Anti-Gender Movements in South Caucasus and the EU. My name is Giulia Pasquinelli. I'm the EU Advocacy Advisor at the Kvinna Foundation, and I will moderate today's session. Let me start by thanking the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy for co-organizing the event with us and for their important work on this issue. The event will be recorded and it will be available on Kvinna's YouTube channel in the coming days. A few words for the audience on how to engage in the discussion today. We will have a Q&A session right after we hear from our panelists. So I encourage you to type in your questions in the dedicated section that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And we will read the questions out to the panelists. Now, a few words of introduction about the rationale behind the event today. Anti-gender movements and narratives have been on the rise in the past years, both in the EU and in South Caucasus. They are part of broader anti-democratic trends emerging in different parts of the globe and targeting freedoms, rights and democratic values, very much in response to progressive forces in society. This phenomenon is leading to the restriction of women's rights and LGBTQI rights, a pushback against gender-based violence legislation, threats to the security of women activists and also marginalized groups, and attacks on journalists and media freedom, among others. So today we will focus on better understanding this transnational phenomenon, which is growing in strength and influence both in the EU and South Caucasus, identify its main features and how it plays out in different contexts, and in particular, how it affects civil society organizations and activists who are working to promote more equal and more inclusive societies. We will also discuss how the EU and the international community at large can help civil society in responding to this phenomenon. We will do so with the help of distinguished speakers who are contributing with their engagement to raise awareness, analyze, and counteract this trend. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Malin Björk, who's a member of the European Parliament with the Left Group. Malin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank Kvinna and the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy for organizing today's event and for inviting me. I think, you know, for me as a feminist, many years, even before being a member of the European Parliament, I think women's human rights are so central to any human rights struggle. And it's so clear that women are key peace builders, democracy builders, and human rights defenders. So it's extremely important that we are part of this struggle against ever more authoritarian, I would say, movements that try to limit, of course, women's lives, but as you said in your introduction, also many other groups' lives and ways of being able to live in our societies. So just as you said, we see from the horizon of the European Parliament that there is a rise in this authoritarian, conservative, fundamentalist right-wing movements and parties that try to little by little control different parts of society in a more authoritarian grip. And it's very clearly so that they also try to control women's rights, and more particularly, I would say, women's bodies. So they're particularly targeting sexual and reproductive health and rights, the issue of abortion, but also contraception, access for young people to decent sexuality education, and so forth. And these forces are also attacking something that has been a long feminist fight for us, the Istanbul Convention, which is a key instrument, international instrument to combat gender-based violence. And with some kind of fake arguments and phony arguments, at least, they try to undermine that important instrument that we have at our disposal and try to opt out of it, and you have seen that it happens outside the EU and also inside the EU member states that they do this. So indeed, we have a very very serious challenge, I would say. And I also see that these authoritarian anti-feminist and anti-women forces act, as I said, on other levels. They attack media freedom, they attack the independence of the judiciary, they attack civil society and trying to make laws that makes it very difficult for civil society to act in a free and independent manner. And these authoritarian movements are also quite often targeting migrants with a very racist and xenophobic discourse. And as you mentioned, also LGBTI persons are often targeted, as we see in Poland and Hungary, and that seems to be some kind of top-on issue for this to mobilize their supporters. What we've also seen from the European Parliament outlook is that they are quite well organized. These forces are more and more organized. They meet together, sometimes under even governmental auspices, like when Orban hosts it. He calls them the family summits or something. But it's actually just it's a gang gathering of very authoritarian and misogynist and homophobic movements that strategize together. So unfortunately, they're quite well organized. They're also quite well funded. But I must say, of course, sitting here in this room with you, with all feminists and women and allies around Europe and even globally, I'm not at all dystopian. So far in the European Parliament, we have been able to act every time against these forces. We are not, for the moment, losing any of the important votes that we have had, be it on rule of law, democracy, independence of the judiciary, or on women's rights and LGBTI rights. So we are actually, at least in this parliamentary space that is quite important in the European Parliament, we have managed to put them at an arm length distance and make them have to back off in terms of their attacks on our rights. So that's a good thing to know, and we do that through, of course, organizing across party lines and defending the box for rule of law and human rights must be the bottom line for what we can accept when we work together. So that has been a useful strategy. I think it's also very clear that one of our other strategies in working against these forces, and you will discuss this more here because they have to be contextual, of course, and will look different in different spaces. But for me, I would just mention three things. I think, of course, to stand by each other's. So sisterhood, international solidarity, and that if they're attacking one of us, they're attacking all of us. And that in the second strategy I would like to mention is that can also be expanded, since there are many groups and sectors of society that are being targeted by these forces. Our possibilities for alliances are growing. We can work together with migrants' rights associations, LGBTI rights associations, with free and independent media associations against these threats that are, that we in the end feel upon our bodies, but they also feel in terms of their activities, of course. And then the third one, I would say, for us to have a positive agenda. Let's not forget that we're not there yet, of course, especially, we're looking around our different contexts. We are bearers of a very positive and a very forward-looking agenda. We want to enforce women's human rights. We want to have good legislation combating violence against women in not one country, two countries, in all our countries. We want to make the Istanbul Convention like the gold star in every country. And so we are bearers, and we should be very proud of that, that we have we are the ones that can actually put forward this agenda, and we should not forget to celebrate when we have victories with, improved consent legislation or improved funding for women's shelters, or things that actually make our progress visible and make a concrete difference in women's lives. So those were my little takes on today's panel. I'm very happy to be able to follow and be part of this important work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malin. Thanks for this overview from sort of your standpoint, and also for the great work that you do within the European Parliament. I particularly liked the final strategies that you mentioned at the end. I think that's very important, that we focus on what we can do together. And that we elaborate on, the various options that we have working together. So certainly, solidarity is something that we'll hear more about also from our next speaker, Petra, but also the fact of, building alliances across sectors and working with sort of different organizations representing different groups. I think that's very important. And also for us to continue to have a positive and forward-looking agenda. So thanks a lot for that. And we will move on now to our next speaker. I'm very happy to give the floor to Petra Andorff, who is the Secretary General of the Kvinna Foundation, for some opening remarks. Petra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you to Center for Feminist Foreign Policy for collaboration on this important topic, and thank you, Malin, for setting the tone for this conversation. I very much appreciate that, and we'll come back and reflect on some of the things you said as well. So the Kvinna Foundation has supported women's rights activists and feminist movements in conflict-affected countries and contexts since the 1990s. And we know that being a vocal woman fighting for the right of women have never been an easy task. But with shrinking space for civil society and the anti-gender movement gaining force, it is steadily becoming more and more dangerous in some contexts and stressful, to say the least, in others, to be a women human rights defender, just to decide to want to stand up for women's and girls' rights. And we have been monitoring the situation for women human rights defenders for about a decade. And today, actually, in about 2 hours, we will launch our new report, which is called Solidarity is Our Only Weapon, which presents an overview of the issues that are most dangerous for activists to work on, type of threats that are most common, and which actors that are behind. However, the report also outlines the strategies that activists use to manage and mitigate the impact of the violence and the threats. And I must say that they are quite similar to the ones that you mentioned, Malin. It's about working together. It's about deciding to create alliances with other groups that you might not have thought of. And you mentioned a few. You talked about groups working for migrant rights and LGBTQ rights. And we see this in a number of the countries where we have asked women human rights defenders. And in total, we interviewed 15 women activists, and the survey that was sent out was answered by 334 women, and they all and female journalists, I would like to add, and they came from 74 countries. So it's really a global study. And it is clear from both the survey responses and their interviews that the anti-gender movement in its broad sense is one of the main obstacles against the work for women's rights internationally. And resistance is built on the narrative of standing up for traditional values, family values, just like you said, Malin. But I don't think that it's a secret that in its core, what we're talking about is power. And women human rights defenders work to disrupt and question existing power structures. And the anti-gender movements are set to stop them. So over 60% in the survey said that they received threats and harassment due to their work as women human rights defenders and female journalists. And we talk, it's threats, it's hatred, and it's even physical harassment. And it seems to have been so normalized during this last decade. Living and working with threats and harassment has increasingly become, as they put it, part of the ordinary workday. And many activists just carry on with their work, often choosing not to report harassment or threats, either out of fear of being harassed by the police or maybe because they are tired and they have deemed it pointless to actually report. And when it comes to slander, a method that is very much used by the anti-gender movement, in many cases, it is so that women human rights defenders, they simply don't want to repeat such false information and accusation. And when we asked in our survey which issues it is that put activists most at risk, it became clear that corruption is number one. So activists that try to combat corruption and investigate corruption cases are the most targeted. And this is followed by activists working on LGBTQI people's rights and combating discriminatory traditional values and anti-gender rhetoric. And who is it then that poses this threat to women's rights? Well, it's the anti-gender movement, it's the authoritarian governments, it's patriarchal religious structures and community leaders who work to silence the feminist movement. And we can also see that women human rights defenders are more and more careful about what they say and how they communicate. This development is a serious threat against democracy. It's a serious threat against gender equality and against women's human rights. And we know from both research and experience that a strong women's movement is key in strengthening legislation on women's rights and making sure that that legislation is followed. And there's a lot that the international community can do to support these important change makers. Financial support is often mentioned and it's crucial, but it's also important that donors recognize the unique risks and threats faced by women human rights defenders, and that there are investments in structures and programs dedicated to the protection of women human rights defenders and women journalists. And we talk about both financial grants and resources dedicated to rapid emergency responses. And once again, I would like to end where Malin also ended, by how the women's movements strike back, because they do. And like I said, it is by joining forces, it is by working together. And both the women activists and the female journalists who we talk to emphasize that even though solidarity and collaboration may be really challenging, it is absolutely crucial. And as one of the activists from Syria who stated, solidarity is important. I know that if I need something, there will be a feminist somewhere who will help. So with those words, I would like to end, say thank you very much. And I very much look forward to the conversation we're going to have here today.
Thank you very much, Petra, for your words. I think a lot that resonates, and that also with what Malin said earlier. Thank you very much for sharing some of the findings of our latest report, which has been also, the link has been posted in the chat, so you're all very welcome to click on it and read the report more in detail. I think some of the things that you mentioned at the end, in particular, you know, financial support for women's organizations and civil society organizations who continue to the struggle, but also very much for the international community, the need for recognizing the specific risks that women and other activists who are working on these issues face on a daily basis. It is unfortunately very worrying, the fact that some of these threats have become part of their normal daily work. So obviously something that needs to be better analyzed and better recognized in order to develop strategies that can tackle this. And also the need to have dedicated programs to support activists in this fight. But I'd like to now move on to our panelists. for a discussion on these issues. We will start with Damian Denkovsky, who's the Deputy Executive Director of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy and also co-author of the report Power Over Rights, Understanding and Countering the Transnational Anti-Gender Movement. So with Damian, I'd like to start by asking you, what are the main findings of the report? In particular, what are the key features of the transnational anti-gender movement? We heard already some elements from our previous speakers, but obviously you carried out a very thorough analysis of this phenomenon. So we'd like to hear from you, Damian. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. I would like to start by also thanking Kvinna for organizing the event today with us, and thank you all for being here. And especially thank you to Malin and Petra for the optimistic and hopeful tone of your remarks, despite the seriousness of the threat that we are facing. At CFFP, we published our Power Over Rights report in March of this year, and it came in 2 volumes. The first one was the analysis of the transnational movement that we are looking at, and the second volume consisted of case studies of about 5 examples, which went deeper into different contextual features of the movement. Because despite the kind of general nature of a lot of the features of the movement, it is very, very dependent on different contexts, and depends on the kind of government that we have, on the kind of civil society that we have, and on the progress of rights advocacy in general. And it's very important that any response be then grounded in those contextual differences. Since the 1990s, there has been an increasing relevance and reach of the anti-gender campaigns, but in particular since 2010 in Europe, we have seen them growing in terms of the advocacy, especially at the multilateral level and at the national level. None of these campaigns are isolated, and they should also not be underestimated. We should also not look at them as pushback, which means that they're not merely reactive, but they're very much proactive in terms of setting up a particular vision of the world that they would like to promote. This is why one of the main findings of our research is that thinking of it as a backlash then takes the rights of women and the rights of LGBTQI people outside of the context of other social and societal debates about power relations like race or culture or religion. And this also potentially can prevent pro-gender and other progressive actors from building their alliances and coalitions beyond the issues that they advocate for in their respective work, and therefore encourages working in silos, which we shouldn't do. As was mentioned before, solidarity and working together is one of our key weapons. The anti-gender movement then is not really just attacking the rights of women or LGBTQI persons, but the very concept of universality of human rights through the lens of the different individual actors, and also attacking the principles of our multilateral system. What some of the examples of this are, a couple of years ago, Poland pushing for a family rights treaty, or the previous administration in the United States under President Trump seeking to set up a global health compact as an alternative to the World Health Organization. The anti-gender movement has to be, we argue, understood in the sort of general context of the decline in freedom and also space for civil society. And many of these democratically backsliding regimes, looking at specifically Hungary and Poland in Europe, but also more broadly, promote state projects to enforce different heteronormative and patriarchal family models, but also aim to curtail reproductive rights and are strongly opposed to the rights of sexual minorities. All of this is taking place under the sort of umbrella term of gender ideology, which once deconstructed doesn't really mean anything, but has come in a way to signify the failure of democratic representation and opposition to this ideology for a lot of its supporters has become almost a means of rejecting different parts of the current socioeconomic order, from the prioritizing of identity politics over material issues, but also the weakening of people's social, cultural, and political security. So this counter-system resistance that is couched in anti-gender narratives very strongly resonates with resisting authority or promoting a particular form of authority that calls back to the comfort of this imagined past of tradition or values. And the main features then of the anti-gender movement are its very disparate and diverse set of actors, starting from traditional right-wing think tanks, religious fundamentalist institutions, certain governments, but also media or academics who don't necessarily look at the anti-gender movement as what it is, but present it as an almost a legitimate alternative way of thinking and uncritically present these ideas, which then once they make their way into the mainstream, because of the, I would say, narrative advantage of the anti-gender movement, because these notions of traditionality or the natural family or the natural order are very easily understood by a lot of people. And with this narrative advantage, these sound bites make their way into the mainstream discussion and are very difficult to then take out. So these actors then collaborate in various degrees of formality, and they have a very transnational nature. So they learn from each other through different conferences and summits, including the World Congress of Families and others. Regularly, conferences are organized on the international level where we see a lot of overlap between the personalities and the speakers from across the different campaigns that all operate sort of independently, but also together. There is one of the particularly interesting features of the anti-gender movement is the astroturfing, as defined by also the European Parliamentary Forum on Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights in their report Tip of the Iceberg, which I would also highly recommend to everyone on funding for the anti-gender movement. And astroturfing refers to the sort of top-down creation of seemingly large grassroots movements of people who are actually controlled and driven by a small number of individuals or institutions. Then the very strong funding structures of the anti-gender movement allow them to be extremely professionalized in terms of how they work and how they operate. And this can be seen on the levels of their communication, on the level of their project work, and especially on being able to get funding from institutions that nominally should be supporting gender equality, including sometimes getting EU funding or state funding from EU member states for their work by being simply able to work through the sort of ticking boxes exercise of project applications. And this is something that is a big gap in our research that we need to look into. Then there's a changing language and strategy and adopting more secular language as religion loses its hold. Then advocacy, including training on opposing gender and progressive language in multilateral fora, etc. So the movement is extremely professionalized, it's extremely broad, and needs to be understood within this broader context of seeking to reestablish power dominance rather than individual campaigns. And that is mostly what drives us to understand that if we don't work in solidarity and don't break out of working in silos, it will be much more difficult for us to respond effectively to this movement. I will maybe stop here and then listen to the inputs from the other panelists. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Damian, also for outlining some of the real complexities behind this movement, and also the fact that its reach is much broader than what it could superficially look like. So it's actually a movement that is attacking the universality of human rights and the multilateral order and the values that are underpin it at large. So something that needs to be understood in its complexity. But at the same time, as you mentioned at the very beginning, it plays out in different ways, in different contexts. And this is also very important to keep in mind, so that obviously that it is analyzed in different contexts, but also that the potential responses to these movements and narratives can be developed based on an understanding of how they play out in the particular context, what the actors are in that particular context, what narratives they use, what strategies, and so on. So I think along this line, we're now going to move to our speakers from South Caucasus to hear their own views and perspectives on how this phenomenon is playing out in their own country. And we're going to start with Eka Tsereteli, who's the director of the Women's Initiative Supporting Group in Georgia. So Eka, can you tell us what are the main actors that are behind this movement and narrative in Georgia, but also what are the manifestations of this movement in your own country?
Thank you, Julie, for your question and for the opportunity to share our findings and position. Though misogyny is a social problem in our country, I would say that the most dramatic reflection of the anti-gender movements in Georgia we can notice in homophobic display in society. During our history of independence, government has always tried to use the existence of radical, anti-gender and ultra-national groups for maintaining its power, attracting electorate and also reproducing social conflicts. It has also often ignored threats or even supported violence by delaying reactions to it or has reacted inadequately. In its time, when the state needed support pillar in society, it has started to empower the Georgian Orthodox Church purposely by improving its image, which is in that period had a low level of trust in society. This resulted with the constitutional agreement and known as the Concordat in 2002 and was signed between the Georgian state and the Orthodox Church, guaranteeing a stable financing system for it. Gradually, the church gained power and made a stand for becoming an influential stakeholder and even political actor. May 17 of 2013 is an illustration for that, where the church practically demonstrated its power and on the expense of LGBTQI community. The same logic or scenario we can see in encouragement of neo-fascist, anti-gender and ultranational groups from the side of the government when they are being maintained for instrumentalization of social conflicts and issues. The leading factor for their fundamental discourse are, of course, women's rights, Orthodox religion and Georgian ethnicity as an imperative. But the most important one they are fixated on is LGBTQI issue, which is interpreted as a sin, the enemy of the demographic development of Georgia, and the threat of traditional understanding of masculinity and femininity. Presenting queer people as an enemy supports misogyny as well as nationalism and the formation of theocratically inclined states, making LGBTQI community as a main object of attack for ultra-nationalist anti-gender movements in Georgia. It needs to be noted that production of anti-gender groups has been gaining more and more sophisticated form during the years, which indicates that their financing and support is growing and gradually they will becoming more organized. During the years, the state has escalated the hostility for different purposes, like collecting votes before elections and shifting attentions from important social problems without considering that the probability of consequences of this aggression and long-term impact of these actions. The fact that capitalization of this cultivated and accumulated aggression could be attractive for some political forces was identified in findings of our representative study on public attitudes toward LGBTQI people conducted back in 2015. And as a result, this year we can see that one of the most active and very radical anti-gender group named Altinfo have officially applied to formally register as a political party. In addition to that, the TV channel managed by the same group got license on broadcasting nationwide. So we can imagine the further development of the situation if we could not oppose it. So in somehow very constructive and very unified way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eka, for sharing this overview of some of the actors that are active in Georgia. And how this movement plays out, but also underlying the issue of the how the financing and the support for these movements is actually growing, including the fact that one of these very famous or infamous groups is now registering or asked to register as a political party. So obviously this is becoming more and more organized and professionalized, as also Damian was mentioning in his presentation. So I'd like to move now to Azerbaijan, obviously a very different situation there compared to Georgia, and would like to hear from Pervana Mammadova, founder of FemAct. So Pervana, can you tell us how anti-gender narratives are playing out in Azerbaijan at the moment? I think we can't yet talk about a movement, but certainly about narratives there. Pervana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. Hello, everyone. And for sure, I can say that the anti-gender narrative in Azerbaijan is quite, it's slightly different from that's in the situation in Georgia. So let me go back a bit to give you a bit of historical review of how the process started. Well, in general, Azerbaijan antagonism and phobia against feminism have been so extensive, and that actually talking about adapting feminist identity or establishing feminist-based organizations or initiatives, they were incredibly slowly moving. And the core of the problem is the deeply rooted cultural patriarchal norms, traditions that were prevailing in the society. So the first feminist groups and the women rights defenders emerged during the late 90s with raising awareness and educational agenda, was breaking the silence, taboo issues in the society, challenging patriarchal norms, patriarchy and the norms, so as reviewing legislation policies, state programs to mainstreaming gender equality. So that was more social political agenda of the first feminist groups that work, as I said in the beginning, and starting from the late 90s. Situation, however, changed when newly emerged feminist group, recently starting from 2019 until these days, that's emerged. So there was when women marches and demonstrations has been taking place, and then the street actions. And when that's gender issues started to get more politicized, shifting from, would say, social, cultural, political, and relatively from the safe space to more political and the dangerous space on this discursive level. And unfortunately, if you look at again history, the both generation of the feminist activists and gender activists, they were attacked by different groups in the society, by the police, in the society, quite in general, quite homophobic. I mean, if we talk even from the gender identity perspective, it's the attacks and mainly would come from a homophobic groups and the nationalistic groups, and the issues, if I can in general summarize, that issues has been already, I mentioned what kind of issues has been raised by the gender feminist activists and the gender activists is related to there was a great need in reviewing legislation, policies, the state programs in order to mainstreaming gender equality. And I would say that there is very clearly, we can state that there is a lack of political will in formulating a government-wide gender policy and action plans. And it's visible in all levels. I mean, if you review and look at the and the way how the budgets also disseminated across all the sectors. Well, those gender-wide, I mean, those policies and the action plans we need to measure in order to prevent gender-based violence, including LGBTQI issues. There is a great need to increase women participation in decision-making in all levels of the society, create also equal opportunities for women and men in labor market, promote women work in leading positions, basically, I already said, in the decision making. So lack of for example, in terms of, I can name that Istanbul Convention is one of the issues that's our concern that has been, which is not ratified by the government. Related to another issues that's, well, there is certain action prepared, several government actually prepared several action plans, which national action plans, that which I want to mention, that's been already for quite a long period, that's not in the parliament, which is not being adopted. The national action plan on preventing gender-based violence has been approved back in November 2020. But again, as I already mentioned, the political will when it comes to budgeting and monitoring mechanism still is not there in related to this particular national action plan. But another plan, another two action plans actually, one is on implementing United Nations Security Council 1325 on women, peace and security is still pending, and the gender equality one. Well, in general, yeah, gender mainstreaming in key sectors is one of the key issues, I would say. Yeah, I think I can stop here.
Thank you very much, Parvana. So it seems to me that your points mainly focus on a lack of commitment really by the government. So in a sense, this anti-gender narrative is playing very much into sort of the hands of the government in not sort of taking the necessary steps, both in terms of legislation, of budgeting, and also of setting the priorities for the country when it comes to gender equality. You mentioned the Istanbul Convention, which has not been ratified. Obviously, that is something that is a concern also in other countries within the EU as well, unfortunately, with countries threatening to pull out. So that is also very much, I think, in the focus of our discussion in Europe as well. But I'd like to move on now to Olya Azatyan, who's an independent researcher from Armenia, currently a PhD student, but has been working on the promotion of human rights and democracy, both nationally and internationally, for many years. So Olya, can you tell us how the anti-gender narratives are playing out in Armenia? But also, I wanted to ask you specifically whether the post-conflict narrative is contributing to strengthening anti-gender narratives in Armenia. Olya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think there has been two big contributing factors in the current situation we have in Armenia. And what we observe in Armenia is that there is basically an inaction coming from the government, unlike what we would have seen from previous time And so the level of interest from the government went down, decreased, and also the volume of engagement from the government has went down. We can also observe that not much civil society enrollment is there. Unfortunately, this is due to many factors. And what we can also observe is that new challenges also appeared as a result of last year's conflict, namely the many issues connected with women refugees, really need for psychological support, the issues of human security has also increased. And it came up and to add all this range of important issues and problems we have had in the country. Like also we can, as Pervana highlighted, we also have a lot of discourses, narratives about the Istanbul Convention, about the anti-discrimination legislation, also the law on domestic violence is not really criminalizing gender-based violence, which is a serious problem. And also the COVID-19 brought in also a lot of problems. Namely, it really hit the so-called economic independence of the women, well, as much as we had in Armenia at that moment. And particularly, it seriously and severely hit the unregistered labor and women who have been somehow hired, but they didn't have contract and they just lost their job without any compensation. And the Armenian government really had a poor response to these COVID-19 consequences as well. So as to the conflict, post-conflict narratives, we can see that two main trends are, they have always existed in Armenian society, but we see that these are really increasing. The first one is, of course, talking about women as soldier-making machines. Really that, okay, we had so many human losses and women have to have more boys who are future soldiers. And the second is, of course, which is being discussed in Armenian society, is like women, whether women should serve in the army or not. So we don't really see any talks and discussions, serious discussions about the peace and also other agenda and also women's involvement in peace building activities, though we also do not see what is exactly the agenda of Armenian government about the peace and peace initiatives. We also don't see much that has been done on Armenia's former UN 1325 National Action Plan, and we currently have the second plan which appeared. It is yet to be seen how that should be implemented, and I hope that we will not have the same poor basically implementation process as with the previous UN 13 National Action Plan. So just also to sum up, I think that this inactiveness of the government is really opening up space for anti-gender narratives, and this is something that needs to be pushed from all sides who are interested in this issue.
Thank you very much, Olya, and I think we'll reflect on this and on how to do this in the next round. But I think at this point I'd like to go back to Georgia, to the situation in Georgia, and ask Eka what has been so far, in your view and from your perspective, the impact of anti-gender narratives in Georgia. And in particular, how does this affect civic space?
Yes. I would say that the last year was challenging for LGBTQI community and the whole country in many ways. To the ongoing COVID pandemic crisis, which is still in place, was added political crisis connected to elections. Unfortunately, power struggle for both ruling party and the opposition became the only focus and consumed the importance of social and economic as well as pandemic crisis. As in previous years, LGBTQI issues were also used in pre-election period for radicalization of society. This instrumentalization was not started recently, and both conservatives and liberal groups used queer people. Conservatives for portray them as a threat to national identity, and liberal groups use them to present their own pro-Westernness. As a result, discussion about homophobia as a systemic and structural social problem is almost absent from their agenda. The development this summer is somehow of manifestation of this crisis. It must be said that the pride as a realization of the right of assembly and manifestation for the Eastern Partnership countries has become a dominant, unified strategy of visibility and kind of litmus tests of democratization for country on the path of geopolitical orientation. For us, feminists from Georgia, this strategy is the subject of criticism, as it is not based on the analysis of the local context of different countries, which is crucial from our point of view, and neglects its importance. Moreover, the combative narrative of defeating groups labeled as homophobic, which accompanies successful implementation of pride, does not represent a language of queer liberation politics for us. Similar militaristic dichotomy disrupt the process of identifying real indicators of homophobia and transforming public attitudes, and fits the agenda of the groups holding the power. But this year, I would say the scale of organizing and mobilizing of the homophobic groups against the March of Dignity, as well as violence they commit, was truly unimaginable, as well as the announcements and behavior from the state, which were also unprecedentedly alarming. On the 5th of July, when the Pride of Dignity supposedly to be held, the state did nothing to prevent the announced violence, unfortunately. Moreover, the Prime Minister, Mr. Al-Bashiri, who appeared to express the will of an imaginary homophobic majority, took advantage of the open cooperation between Tbilisi Pride and the opposition parties and labeled the issue of queer people's assembly in public space as the political opposition's attempt to create chaos. On the other side of the polarity, the main protagonists were political party and mass media leaders who are positioning themselves as the supporters of Pride. However, the issue of homophobia or LGBTQI people soon disappeared from their protest messages also. In fact, we are still recovering from these tragic consequences of state indifference and inaction in the form of increased homophobic and misogynic crimes and murders in this day. And unfortunately, this crisis is worsened and worsened every day, I would say. Thank you.
Thanks, Eka, for these reflections. I think you pointed out very well what the risks and the consequences of instrumentalization of these issues by political groups and parties, and how that can play out in how that has played out in the particular context of Georgia. So I'd like now to move to Azerbaijan again and ask Pervana obviously in a context where civic space is already limited, are the anti-gender narratives, in your view, contributing to further shrinking this space?
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, I can say definitely yes. And I mean, talking from NGO crackdown and shrinking spaces, that civil society in Azerbaijan has been facing both legal and practical restriction for more than 7 years now, and lengthy and troublesome registration process, as well as restriction to get foreign funding, remain the main issues of the NGOs in Azerbaijan. Well, all this and among the others. So actually, so this definitely basically put all the internal barriers for civil society to address this anti-gender narrative, or to deal with those. There is recent improvement from the government side. I would say it's quite visible that country's leadership is shifting their approach towards NGO, but this is very, very early stages, and we hopefully it will move further and there will be some improvements. There is actually internally within the civil society and gender organizations, there is also some kind of a conflicting the issues. I think it's the issues related to the generations as well, which we internally need to deal ourselves. Recently, that I was already mentioned, this recent feminist movement and the previous generations of the feminist activists and the women rights defender organizations think that there is a need in national dialogue process to get together an established women agenda in order to make sure that anti-gender narrative is addressed. And one of the and the issues related to that, there are many issues that I'll try to mention now. This integrating gender equality into the national policies and the programs. And another things what civil society was a limited access. What the civil society can do is or they need have done, but again with limited spaces. For example, none of the national action plans that has been submitted to the parliament has been consulted with the civil society. So the process is not really transparent, and the recommendations are, well, basically there is no consultations. That's the recommendations from the civil society could be also included in the preparation process, as well as once they're approved, submitted. And yeah, well, what I can say is basically enhancing in order to enhancing women voices and in all areas needed, which is again on the shoulders of the civil society, women voices and economic activities in the critical areas of the in all levels of the society, like security, infrastructure, energy, water, public sector management, whatever we will be dealing. I think this is important. This enhancing women voices would greatly enhance their participation in the development and the decision that affect them. There are, and of course, those measures are necessary to ensure that women groups will fully benefit from all development interventions. And other issues are related to the civil society, the role of civil society in women, peace and security, in promoting women, peace and security agenda. I think here we can easily firmly say that the peace building is quite the peace building process is not gender responsive and gender sensitive. There is no woman actually present in the table. So I think definitely women need to get the seats and in the table with such important issue for the region when it comes to the peace building, and the gender values and the gender needs to be gender equality needs to be integrated, and the gender mainstreaming needs to be integrated in the whole peace building process. Yes, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Barbana. I think a lot of points from you there on what also needs to be done. We'll move on to Armenia now, and I'd like to ask Olya, in your view, what has been the impact of anti-gender narratives in Armenia, including the impact on civil society, and also if you can specifically talk about the impact that it might have had on the security of women human rights defenders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I've been talking recently to many human rights defenders, women human rights defenders, and trying to sort out whether after the revolution they have been less targeted or they have been more targeted, and they have been most of them have been telling me that after the Armenian revolution, where we think that the democracy is finally setting up in the country, human rights defenders are more targeted in Armenia. And the reason they are explaining why they are more targeted is that former political elite that is trying to regain a power in they are using these issues, women's rights issues, that just as a political tool to kind of to set up a kind of political arguments with the current political group in power, with Pashinyan's team, and that is why they are trying kind of to further highlight and insert the gender stereotypes existing in the society, and that is the reason that this hate speech towards women, targeting both online and offline, all the threats that women's rights defenders are experiencing in Armenia has increased. And there are very limited safe spaces in the country where women can get together for sharing their concerns, for empowering each other, unfortunately. And in terms of who is targeting human rights defenders, there are two groups, the group that is ordering and the group that is doing. And these are not the same people, basically. It's the doers are receiving their political orders from their bosses. And some human rights defenders have been telling me that this is not all the orders of anti-gender narratives are coming from Armenia within, they are coming also from neighboring other countries. So what is also shocking, that unfortunately media is also keeping silence in terms of these violations, and media is kind of, we know that when we keep silence, we are supporting the one who is making crime, basically, and the media is really keeping much silence. We also do not see many support towards women coming from the political parties. And what is the most astonishing for me also, I don't see many solidarity and supporting messages coming from the rest of Armenian civil society. And basically in this situation, women are really staying on their own. And I want also to highlight that the state is also failing to fulfill its obligations, ensuring human rights protection in the country, because we have been observing many cases where human rights defenders are saying that they have reported certain type of attacks, but either the law enforcement agencies didn't really initiate the case, or they just tried to close the case as quickly as possible. So unfortunately, we don't see much hope at the moment, and we can see that the space is really shrinking for women's rights defenders. And I think that we should join the efforts in the country, regionally and globally, to deal with this issue.
Thank you very much, Olya. Some disturbing information there, unfortunately, about how women human rights defenders have been specifically targeted and attacked, and the inaction both by sort of law enforcement agencies, but also the media being rather silent about this. So obviously this calls for the need for support also from civil society actors, but also the international community. And I think in this last leg of our discussion, I'd like to move on more to this, to focus on what could be the responses, what could be the strategies, what has worked already in certain contexts, and can that work in other contexts, or how does it need to be sort of adapted and reformulated? And on this, I'd like to ask Damian, based on your study and the report that you published, what have been successful strategies and tactics to counteract the rise and spread of anti-gender movements and narratives?
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, like you said, very much these are in a way decontextualized findings, and I'm very much looking forward to hear what differences the other panelists see and what expertise they have in terms of responding in their specific context. And interestingly enough, the very first kind of feature of successful responses to the anti-gender movement is responding to the context and thinking about timing. So this means conducting much more research, specifically contextual research that is not only done in English or other major languages, but also really looking at local and regional dynamics and developing tailor-made responses. This can mean attitude surveys, it can mean historical analyses, it means power analysis and others, and specifically trying to understand what is it that is making people who, in a way, believe the narrative of the anti-gender movement to believe this narrative, and what makes them oppose the issues in question, and then developing responses specifically to allay those fears, because to a large extent the narratives of the anti-gender movement are fear-based and vagueness-based, and they need to be deconstructed, but in the appropriate way. Then another thing is that something that was already mentioned a lot in the discussion today, building very wide coalitions, and this means solidarity, and this means avoiding siloed thinking. And then once we have that, then we need to respond in an appropriate political or social moment. So either capitalizing on a development that's already ongoing, or building on international developments, or whatever it is that might make it opportune to respond in that moment, rather than going, because I mean, these kinds of issues often go against the wind, so to speak, in a lot of contexts, but going with the wind as much as possible, it helps the cause. Then it's the matter of setting concrete goals and being very clear about what we want to achieve, because we cannot sort of respond to the anti-gender movement in one campaign, right? We need to know exactly what it is that we are responding to and what is the goal that we want to achieve, and work incrementally, but always having the bigger strategy in mind and knowing what the ultimate goal is. And this being done again with narratives that resonate with the public. One other thing that I think progressive civil society could do a lot is re-engaging with the multilateral system and breaking this sort of pattern of being disillusioned with the multilateral system, and taking back all of this space that has been claimed by anti-gender actors in the meantime. And this can be the Council of Europe, this can be the European Union, the United Nations, and other fora, where we need to advance and advocate for the rights that we want defended, because they can have a trickle-down effect on national context, and they can provide the sort of legal or at least conceptual backing to human rights advocates to speak about international standards. So we need to make sure that they're not eroded at those levels. Now, all of this actually sounds kind of great, right? But it depends on securing sufficient financial resources, and it depends on real and meaningful political support from self-proclaimed gender champion states and institutions. So it's a matter of clearly standing up for the rights and freedoms that we're talking about, and for the universality of so sending these political signals, but also committing sufficient finances so that civil society can act. And I mean, in a lot of contexts, this is to varying degrees possible. But I think I would like to comment briefly on sort of EU funding structures and priorities, and the kind of mismatch between what are the stated goals and values of especially the European Union and the way that it funds civil society, especially grassroots feminist civil society operating locally. A lot of the EU funding is inaccessible, especially for grassroots movements, and in many contexts where national funding is either unavailable or relatively low in volume, a lot of civil society and NGOs depend on EU funding specifically. And if this is made unavailable, either because of the small size of the organization or the complexity of funding mechanisms or the inaccessibility for various reasons, language or otherwise, then it makes it very difficult to act sort of in a coordinated and coherent way. It also means that long-term funding is often unavailable because of the different project logics in which EU funding tends to operate. And there are then campaigns, and that makes it difficult to launch large-scale and long-term campaigns, and also engage in strategic litigation, which is very important for defending rights, to also being able to bring actors and governments to court and be able to argue that certain legislation or certain policies are simply not in accordance with either domestic or international human rights standards. Then this also means that there's a difficulty in developing long-term communication campaigns and the skills to do this, because organizations are kind of kept small, and that means that the funding that is available kind of also in a way limits the capacity to act in a very significant way to respond to the anti-gender movement. And just very quickly to the sort of in the EU specifically, there's the transparency of donors and funding is not as developed or not as transparent as it could be or it should be. So that means that there is a very low availability of data on sort of how EU funding actually is being used and where it goes and what the impact of it is. And especially with the lacking of monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that can be also double verified, then that this makes it difficult to know exactly where the money goes and what to argue for. So this is another research gap that I just wanted to highlight here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Damian. A lot of interesting suggestions there about possible responses and strategies to respond to this phenomenon. Let's move on quickly to the three different contexts. I'll ask you to be rather brief in your answers because we want to take time to answer a few questions from the audience. Eka from Georgia, can you tell us what can civil society and the international community, including very much the EU, do to counteract these movements? The floor is yours.
Yes, it's quite a tricky question. What can we do? But I think that in Georgia, fundamental as well as liberal values such as human rights and equality are just learning to stand on feet. And if consistent strategic political steps will be taken, we can have grounds for optimism. I can bring example regarding decreasing violence against women. If we compare the experience of Eastern European states, especially Poland or Hungary, to the context of Georgia, it could seem that there's a huge similarity in developments, yeah? But there is one core difference for Georgia, despite the fact that a big part of our population declares to be Orthodox Christian. Society is not as deeply religious as, for example, in Poland. And the religiousness as well as other values in the country are superficial and fragile. This indicates that the society is not solidly formed and gives us a lot of space for changes. Yeah, and this proven somehow with recent research done by UNDP and UNFPA in 2020 regarding social perception of gender roles in Georgia, where they comparing their previous research done in 2013 and respondents answered responses. 50% of respondents actually said that this violence is unacceptable. So it's doubled this percent from 2013. So I think that purposeful and strategically planned efforts brings realistic changes in attitudes to our human rights and liberal values in Georgia. But also we need to remember that reverse of this progress is equally realistic, and it's important to constantly work on perceptions and attitudes to strengthen this existing progress, and not perceive the harmonized legislation as a sufficient guarantee in democratic processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eka, a useful reminder there. Azerbaijan, Pervana, can you tell us what you think civil society and the international community, including the EU, can do to counteract these narratives? And I'll ask you please to be brief.
Sure. I think I've already mentioned a couple of them, but I will be quite, will be quick. So definitely continue to support efforts to strengthen a national policy system and the public advocacy for advancement of preventing gender-based violence, including LGBTQI issue. Integrating gender equality in education system, education curriculum, even starting from the preschool. So I think it will definitely contribute a lot to this anti-bullying, anti-gender and LGBTQI issues again. So around that, so gender equality must be in the part of the education. Women agenda, establishing national dialogue process with participation with all relevant actors, state, civil society, media outlets, academia, which will contribute to building consensus around that vision, how to bring transformative change for gender equality and women empowerment. Definitely continuing supporting civil society in countering anti-gender narrative, preventing gender-based violence at the grassroots level, while increasing the number of the shelters and different stuff, related around the preventive gender-based violence issue. What I mentioned previously, the supporting and lobbying adoption and follow up on implementation, National Action Plan on 1625 on Women, Peace and Security, and National Action Plan on Gender Equality. And as already mentioned, there is very few space for women peace builders in the society. So the strengthening women rights organization and peace activists and civil society also, those who are working on the peace building. I think I can stop here, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Pervana, for your suggestions, but also for being brief and to the point. And we'll round off with Olya. What can civil society and the international community, including the EU, do in the context of Armenia to counteract this phenomenon?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I think it is really crucial now to support the Armenian civil society because it's undergoing its own turbulences at the moment as a result of the conflict and also COVID-19, also plus distance working, and so there is not much consolidation at the moment. And the platforms that existed before have closed down or are not really functioning as they used to. As for the EU, I think it's a bit problematic in terms of public perception what the EU is up to in Armenia, because they are not always working transparently, and there are a lot of questions in terms of their priorities in Armenia. And of course, I should mention also the lack of public trust towards the EU in the country, as people think that during the war last year, when people were calling out for support, EU remained really silent. And if in that very difficult situation, EU was nowhere, and then what it is now doing in the country, so there are a lot of questions the EU has to really come up with and have an honest conversation about its priorities and values they would like or they are promoting in the country. So in terms of the other international organizations that are working in the region and in the country, I think it's important to support really the data collection process in terms of really doing a lot of researches, looking at specific things and narrowing down the topics and going really deeper in each issue. It's important also not to work directly in Yerevan, in the capital of Armenia, but also directly work with regional centers and the regions in the communities as well, because we know that still too much donor funding is landing in the capital, which I think from feminist perspective is not good. So it's also important to organize platforms for domestic conversations, because the feminist community in the country has its own issues among themselves as well. And I think there are also a lot of conversations that needs to promote it also between different groups of women's rights defenders, like the feminist, radical feminists, like conservative feminists, etc. And of course, education and campaigns. In terms of the working with the government, it's important to support the process of gender mainstreaming, which I think the EU is doing, but I'm not aware of the details. I know that the Armenian government has initiated at some point gender-sensitive budgeting as well. So I don't know where they are up to, because they have other priorities at the moment. But of course, as I started my talk, I want to end up my talk is highlighting the most important issue, to really push the Armenian government to bring back gender issues into the agenda. And this is what we need to promote, and we need to really push the Armenian government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olya, for these suggestions and reflections, including on the role of the EU and what the EU could do better or differently. I'd like to take some questions now that we received from the audience. So first of all, actually, we have a comment by Natia on something that was mentioned by Eka. The registration of the Alt Info initiated party was approved today, so they are now officially a political party. Eka, I wonder if you want to comment on that or not. Okay, no. So we can probably move on to the next one. A question by Maria: why the Azerbaijan government is not ratifying the Istanbul Convention? What's official and non-official explanation for it? I wonder if Pervana wants to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, non-official one, there is, I think it's widely spread myth about the Istanbul Convention is all about this the rights of the LGBTQI peoples, and this is something against of our values, norms, and so on, and the culture. So that's non-official part, but the official, definitely, which this is something that I already mentioned, there is a lack of political will to address this issue. And I think the government understand the commitments once this Istanbul Convention will be ratified, and so what kind of commitment they need to take in terms of provisions of the legal provision, infrastructure, this shelter, I mean, social services, all the things. It's quite expensive exercise, which is again not in the agenda for the government.
Thank you very much, Pervana. And we have a question and observation by Juliet, who's saying, not so much a question, but an observation, and interested in your perspective. If we were to frame the transnational anti-gender movement as a tool of hybrid warfare on the same level of cyber crime, fake news, etc., do you think it would be taken more seriously by those more interested in hard security issues and male politics, including the media and mainstream civil society? We have become familiar in the West with the concept of culture wars, but even this implies it is about culture rather than the instrumentalization of culture, values, identity in service of power. Who would like to take this question of the panelists? Any takers?
I mean, I can comment really quickly, although I think this question deserves a sort of a conversation on its own. Specifically, I don't necessarily think that that's a good idea, because I feel that the hard security approach to a lot of these issues and male politics is sort of the root of a lot of these problems in a way, and it creates this kind of subjugation of what is important enough, or like it plays into the narrative that some things are not important enough to be considered by the real people who decide things, rather than, even though I see the point of that it might be from our side in a way pragmatic or instrumental to do that, but I feel like it would backfire. I think what we need to be doing more is humanizing the issue and responding, or humanizing the subjects of these issues. So by not talking so much about abstract concepts, whether they're culture wars or the instrumentalization of culture for the maintenance of power, but rather talking about people's lived experiences and real experiences, and how these policies impact the lives and security and livelihoods of people, in order to be able to, because I think we should be aiming more for empathy rather than securitization. That would be my very short comment, but I think it's a really cool question. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Damian, for these comments on what is a rather complex question, actually. Another question from Zam is asking, can any of the panelists or keynote speakers talk about their understanding of non-authoritarian anti-gender actors? For example, so-called trans-exclusionary radical feminists are a significant group that target trans people, seemingly separate from authoritarian governments or certain religious groups. I'm especially interested to hear what feminist groups are doing about this, but also others working on anti-gender. Any takers for this question? Yes, Damian, thank you. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but I think just also really briefly, I do see them. I do see the trans-exclusion radical feminists as kind of allied with the authoritarian power structures, especially looking at the collaboration between some of the largest sort of proponents of the anti-gender movement from the United States, such as the Heritage Foundation, and their collaboration with TERFs to kind of promote the idea that trans women are not women, which I think is quite detrimental. But in that sense, like, it's not authoritarian. I still find, even though they are nominally feminist, I still find that approach authoritarian in the sense of deciding who is deserving of certain spaces and who is deserving to have their rights defended. Considering that we have about 1 minute left of the panel, that would be my very short answer to this.
Thank you so much, Damian. And then I'd like to take one final question. Or Eka, sorry, you wanted to comment, or you've taken your hand down?
Yeah, I would like to comment briefly, because actually in Georgia especially, I can't say regarding Armenia and Azerbaijan, but feminist movements rather growing up in Georgia, and we do not have such differentiated groups yet. However, we faced quite big problems raising LGBT women's issues in the women's organizations agenda. They opposed quite hard to these issues. Back in, if we back in 2012, starting from 2012, I would say, and there was a big struggle on that regard. So we had not much allies in this struggle. However, but gradually things are changing, and now we have more or less allies, not much, but still we have some allies in women's organizations also, who are not, only very few of them are claiming themselves as feminist organizations, however. Thank you.
Thank you, Eka. And I'd like to take one final question from Maria, who's asking, I wonder if the experts have monitored any change in gender narrative after wars in South Caucasus, Georgia in 2008, and Armenia, Azerbaijan 2016 and 2020. And whether the dynamics of patriarchy and war have been explored from the perspective of rights of men also involved in the war, and whether there are prospects in these contexts to dialogue around justice-driven peace processes, tackling it also from a gender perspective. Olya, please go ahead.
Yeah, really quickly. I said in the beginning of my talk about the narratives, how the war has changed or has kind of intensified certain stereotypes in the society. I would suggest later when the recording appears to go back and check the recording. I would explain again, but we have limited time now.
Okay, thank you very much, Olya. So I think we're running out of time, but I'd like to give everyone, Pervana as well, the opportunity to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, regarding this one, I just want to say that women within the Women, Peace and Security Advisory Council, which was recently established by the group of the gender experts and the peace builders, we have done a couple of assessment to see the role of women and how the war actually affected the gender effects of on men and women, and there will be soon in public. So I think if they can through the Kvinna till Kvinna, actually this was supported by the Kvinna till Kvinna. So I think since we don't have a lot of time here, we just advocate that if they can follow the website of the Kvinna till Kvinna, and they will be soon publish this. But what I can say clearly, this is one of the things that is unfortunately these traditional roles of the women, the gender roles, they were quite visible during the after the war, and during the war, after the war, when women were more classified and also put in this area of this dealing with humanitarian aid and the humanitarian crisis, while not being that their voices heard or being in the decision making related to any of the processes at that stage.
Thank you very much, Pervana. And I think we've exhausted our time, but I just want to ask the speakers for one final, very, very quick round with a final reflection from your side on moving forward. What do you think is more important in terms of tackling this phenomenon, either in your particular context or at regional level or a transnational, international level? If you can share one final reflection from your side on this, and then we'll close the event. I will maybe start with Eka.
Well, I will try to say last optimistic note. I think we should start or continue broadening networks with groups who share vision and are conscious of the importance of systemic changes. And I believe that solidarity and intersectional approach is the only way to enhance feminist voices and queer voices and bring real sustainable changes and oppose anti-gender sentiments in our countries.
Thank you very much. And Pervana?
I totally share Eka's vision. Just want to add from the Azerbaijani perspective, specifically, I think this solidarity and this dialogue process internally, maybe between the different generations of the feminist movements that's been here, that if we can get together, learn from our experiences, successful, non-successful, I mean, lesson learned, and try to see have the common strategy. Only the working together we can definitely achieve this countering this anti-gender narrative.
Thank you, Pervana. And Olya?
Yeah, I would also definitely call for joining the efforts against this big trouble and really try to fight back this whole narrative that is coming from conservative patriarchal channels, and really open up space for solidarity and for healing and for understanding each other and listening to each other, which is sometimes we are not so good at. And also, of course, reaching out to our like-minded people across the boundaries, because no matter that the contexts are different, we all experience as women the same difficulties, somewhere less, somewhere more, but we all undergo all this discrimination and hate speech and all those challenges. And I think that's I call out everyone and to join the fight and to join the efforts to open up our space, which this conservative patriarchal society has stolen from us, and go back to do our best to go back to our space, to regain our space.
Thank you, Olya. Damian?
I'm not sure what else I can add that want to be. I can just echo everything that's already been said, and my kind of underline at the point that our solidarity and our networks need to go, as mentioned, beyond borders, but also beyond all of the sectors, and engaging also with organizations working on anti-racism and anti-ethnic discrimination and engaging also with progressive faith-based organizations, and really trying to find all the allies everywhere that work for for inclusive societies, and trying to combine forces and to learn within our movements and from each other's movements on how best to do that and really capitalize on our best practices. Thanks.
Thank you a lot, Damian. And I wonder if, Petra, you want to share also some final thoughts?
Well, I primarily want to say thank you very much to everyone that has contributed, and thank you to everyone who has contributed with questions as well. And I think that you've all said it very eloquently. We need to work in solidarity. We need to work together. And Malin, unfortunately, had to go, but I want to remind of where she started, saying that in the European Parliament, they have worked over political party lines, and they have so far been very successful in holding back. So that's also just really reinforcing what you've all said in learning to listen and to invite each other to each other's spaces and see where we can find the lowest common denominator in where we work, and be okay with that, and be upfront with where we don't the issues we don't agree on, and the issues that we do agree on, and see where we can work together. So thank you very much. And thank you, Julia, for this excellent moderation of this very complicated, but so important topic.
Thank you so much, Petra. Thank you to all the panelists and to the audience for a really interesting discussion. It felt like, you know, we've just started to scratch the surface of what is a really complex phenomenon and its manifestations at different levels in different contexts. So we'll encourage you all to read the reports that were shared also in the chat, and more will be coming, as was mentioned, on our website. And please join this common effort from your own standpoint. So thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time.